Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Samach Ches is a combination of the halachos of what happens when the water needed for a bris milah spills. How can I bring water to the correct courtyard? We're going to be covering a number of halachic issues trying to solve that problem. The majority of the sugyas will focus on the concept of bittul b'shus, which is again when you don't have an erev chatzeres or a shitufim mavos where you need one. One of the people can abandon his property, abandon his rights to the yard, abandon his rights to the house, or both of them in order that everybody else should be able to carry. We are going to discuss where that works, when that works, can that be reversed on Shabbos, and a number of other issues. So first of all, the Gemara is in the middle of a discussion about what happened when somebody's water spilled. Now, the way that bris milah was performed in the days of Chazal required a container of hot water. It was for the safety of the child. It was needed. It was absolutely necessary. You couldn't do it without it. And therefore, if the water spilled, it was a problem. And if they didn't have the water, they wouldn't be able to do the bris. It would cause them to not be able to do the mitzvah of bris on Shabbos. Now, of course, this is when the bris milah falls out on Shabbos. So the Gemara is trying to figure out what happens when the water spills. So the Gemara brought one incident in which the water spilled. Rava first said, bring it from the next courtyard, but there was no erev chatzeres. He said, rely on the shituf mavos, but there was no shituf mavos. So he said, have a goy do it. And on that, the Gemara said that there was a challenge, and the Gemara left open what the challenge is, and that's where Daf Samaches picks up. The Gemara says that the challenge on it is as follows. You cannot have a goy do malacha for you, even for the sake of being able to perform a mitzvah, like bris milah. Proof of that is from the mitzvah of sprinkling paraduma water on somebody who needs to become tohar. Now, doing that is a isser d'Rabbanan on Shabbos, but it's needed for a mitzvah. You have to be able to do all the mitzvahs that he needs to do inside the Beis HaMikdash. Yet, we do not allow it. So you see that even though it's only an isser d'Rabbanan, sprinkling the water, however, it's not allowed even in case of a mitzvah. So you shouldn't be allowed to have a goy do malachavi, which is an isser d'Rabbanan. Also, in this situation, when it's in order to allow a mitzvah of bris milah to be performed, that shouldn't be enough of a reason. It shouldn't be a solution. The Gemara answers you cannot prove anything from the fact that hazah, sprinkling the paraduma water, is not allowed even in the situation of a mitzvah, because this is far less of a problem. You're not actually telling the guy to do a malacha d'oraisa. You're telling the guy to do a malacha d'Rabbanan. You're not asking him to boil up water on Shabbos. You're just asking him to bring it through the yard. And therefore, Rava was correct in saying that you could do that. You could have a guy do that in order to be able to perform a mitzvah on Shabbos. Now the Gemara says that Rabba bar Rav Chanan asked Abai, how is it that you and Rabba, two tremendous Talmidei Chachamim, live in a chutzner? They were neighbors in the same chutzner, and there's no erev chatzeres. How is it possible? Don't you realize you need one? So the Gemara says that Abai said, listen, there's really no way that we could have an erev chatzeres here. Rabba is too much of a chashav individual to go around asking people to give a piece of bread for the erev chatzeres. I'm too busy learning. I don't have time to go running around asking everybody to give a piece of bread. The other people who live in the mavai don't care. They don't even know that there is such a halacha. The only potential solution would be is if I would be mizakeh some food to everybody. I would take food, I would give it to one individual, and he would have in mind to be kohen to acquire it on behalf of everybody else. That way everybody would have a piece of bread that I'm holding, and then they could have a shetufim b'vois or erev chatzeres with that. Now, usually wine would be used, because usually wine is what's used for a shituf mavois. The problem is that if they would come and ask me for it, I wouldn't give it to them, because I don't have enough to give out to everybody every Shabbos. And therefore, it's a situation where it's a shituf mavois, where if the people came and asked for it, they wouldn't be able to get it, and the halacha is that that's not a good shituf. It doesn't count. It would be canceled. Therefore, there is no solution, and that's why we don't have an erev chatzeres. So the Gemara says, well, why can't you just have a huge barrel of vinegar? Keep it in the yard. That's where they keep a shitufei mavois anyway. And you're not going to use the whole vinegar. It takes a year to finish a barrel of vinegar. So you'll leave it, and whatever ends up being at the bottom of the barrel at the end of the year, that was the erev chatzeres. You'll just use the vinegar as usual. If somebody comes and asks you, give them some vinegar. It's not that big a deal. So the Gemara says, but how could you do that? Don't we know that you cannot just assume that whatever is left over at the end of a large container is the is the shitufei mavais. That's assuming the concept of breira, that I don't know which wine, which vinegar is the wine which belongs to everybody, which is the shituf mavais, and it'll be breira, it'll be figured out later when we see what's left at the end of the barrel. That's not an agreed upon concept, and we have a brisa that says you're not allowed to do that. So the Gemara says there's a different brisa that says you are allowed to do it. The Gemara says it's not a kasha, it's Beis Hillel against Beis Shammai. And there's a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai as far as relying on breira in a situation like that. What is their discussion? Their discussion is if you have a corpse in a house, the halacha is that the corpse is matame everything in the house. What about things in the doorway or things on the windowsill? So that depends. The doorway or the windowsill that the mace, the corpse, is going to be brought out through, that is considered part of the house, and it's matame everything that's in the doorway or in the windowsill. The rest of the doorways and windowsills are not tame. Anything in them is not included in the tama. However, that's only if you know which window you're going to take the mace out from, or which doorway. If you don't know, and they're all equal candidates, then they all are tame. Now, if somebody widens one of the windows, so then that becomes the window that the mace will come out through, and all the other doorways and windows are fine. What if somebody just thinks, oh, I'm going to widen the window and I'm going to take the mace out through this particular window? He just has in mind. Is that enough to make all the other windows and doorways tahar? So Beis Hillel says yes. Beis Shammai says only if he had that thought before the person died. If it's after the person died, it's too late. You cannot say, well, now it turns out that this was the window or doorway that the mace was going to come out through all along, and therefore that he was never tummy in the first place. Beis Hillel says you could say that. You say, look, there was one doorway that the mace was going to go through. We didn't know which one it was. Now we do. So even though he died earlier, now it has been a huvrar l'mafrei. We found out later that the doorway that the mace was going to come out through was this particular one. Beis Shammai says that's not enough to be metaher all the other doorways and windows. It's got to be that before he died there was one designated one. So you see, Beis Hillel holds of breira, Beis Shammai does not hold of breira. Okay. The Gemara now goes back to the topic of the spilled water, and the Gemara has some other solutions for what to do when the water spills. So Rava said one suggestion. He said, let's ask the mother of the baby. She's considered to be sick. She just gave birth 8 days ago, and she's not sick enough that you can have a Jew do malacha for her on Shabbos, but you could have a guy do malacha for her on Shabbos. Let's ask her if she needs hot water for herself. If she does, we'll be able to have a guy heat up water. It'll be permitted for her because she's not feeling well, and that will be enough. We'll use some of that extra water for the baby. So Gemara says that Rav Mashashi said to Rava, the mother, she doesn't need any water. The mother here is busy eating tamarim, the dates. She has no problem at all. So she doesn't need hot water. So Rava said, okay, maybe she's just confused. She's so... she struggled so hard during the birth, she's still confused. She doesn't know exactly what's coming and what's going, but really that's why she's eating the dates, even though she's not really holding by eating dates. But really she does need water. Okay, there was another incident where the water spilled, and here Rava had a different suggestion. Rava's house was in the chutzner in which the water was. The baby was in a house in a different chutzner, but the two chutzeres had a doorway between them. It wasn't the same chutzner, it was a doorway between them. So what they needed to do was bring the water from Rava's chutzner through the doorway into the other chutzner and then into the house. So Rava wanted to do bittul rishus. Rava apparently was the only one who did not join the Erev Chatzeres, and that's why they couldn't carry out of his Chatzer. He wanted to do bittul rishus. He wanted to cancel his rights to the Chatzer, or maybe he was the only one who lived in that Chatzer. He wanted to cancel his rights to the Chatzer. Therefore, other people would be able to carry from that Chatzer into the adjoining Chatzer and then into the house. So Rava said, look, there's just one problem, is I'm afraid I'm going to accidentally carry from my house into the Chatzer because I'm so used to doing it. If I cancel my rights, I'm not allowed to do that. If I do bittul rishus, I can't do that. So you know what I want? I'm going to ask my household to move all our things from the outer room to the inner room. The outer room was where the men usually did their thing, and the inner room was where the women were. So he said, I'm going to move my stuff to the inner room, and then I'll be a mevatel rishus. That way I won't be in the room that's nearest to the courtyard. I won't accidentally carry out into the yard. That'll stay that way for the rest of Shabbos, and in the meantime I'll be mevatel rishus. You can carry from my courtyard to the next courtyard and into the house, and everything will be fine. So Gemara says, how do you let her do that? Don't you know that Shmuel holds that you're not allowed to do Bittul Rishos to carry it from one yard to another yard? We've seen this in the last few blot. Shmuel says you can only do Bittul Rishos for a jointly owned yard, not for two neighboring yards. It doesn't help a situation like that. So Rava said, not a problem. I don't hold like Shmuel. Shmuel says you can't. I hold like Rav, who says that you can. I hold like Rav Yochanan, who says that you can. The Gemara says, hold on a second. If you don't hold like Shmuel, so then how come you have to move your things from the outer room to the inner room? Don't you know that if you don't hold like Shmuel, there's a way to get around the fact that there's Bittul Rishos? You can actually reverse Bittul Rishos. You could do Bittul Rishos. They'll carry the water. The yard is not yours. You're now forbidden to carry from your house into the yard. But then the people who have your rights in the yard can now do Bittul Rishos on that. They can reverse the Bittul Rishos and say they're relinquishing their rights in your yard. And now the yard goes back to you. And now you can reclaim your Rishos and you can carry the yard from your house back into the yard. Why do you have to move your things? And it's forbidden for you the whole Shabbos. So Rava said, because that's a different halacha, and on that halacha, I do hold like Shmuel. I hold that you cannot reverse it. Shmuel says you can't reverse it. And I also hold that you are allowed to do a Bittul Rishos from yard to yard, not like Shmuel. So the Gemara says, how could you hold in one of these like Shmuel and one of these not like Shmuel? Don't you know that they're dependent on each other? The reason Shmuel says you're not allowed to reverse the Bittul Rishos, which is what Rava is saying he holds, he says, I hold that he can reverse it. So the reason why you can't reverse it, Shmuel says, is because it becomes like two separate yards. Meaning, again, Shmuel holds you're only allowed to do Bittul Rishos when there's a joint shared yard. There are two houses that share the yard. And then Shmuel says, and once one person has done Bittul Rishos, it's like he's out. He's gone. He has no more rights in the yard. He's totally out of here. Now he becomes like somebody in a different yard. It's not a joint shared yard anymore. That's why it can't be reversed, because the other people, those who now have his rights, would have to do Bittul Rishos of their own to get his rights back to him. They would have to be mevatel. They would have to abandon their own rights and let it go back to him. But now it's already 2 yards. It's halachically considered 2 yards because he doesn't have rights in that yard anymore. So the whole reason that Shmuel says you can't reverse the Bittul Rishos is because he holds you can't do Bittul Rishos on neighboring yards. How could Rava hold you could do Bittul Rishos on neighboring yards and still hold that you cannot reverse that Bittul Rishos? He should say that you could reverse the Bittul Rishos because there's no problem even if they become like neighboring yards once you've lost your rights, but you could still reverse that. So Gemara says it's not correct. The reason that Shmuel holds that you cannot reverse the Bittul Rishos has nothing to do with the fact that it becomes like 2 separate yards. The reason is because it starts looking like a joke. You abandon your rights, he abandons his rights, it goes back to you, back to him, you have the rights, he has the rights. You just say, I'm abandoning my rights, and you're not really abandoning your rights, because in 2 minutes you're going to get your rights back. So the whole thing is a joke. You're making a joke out of these halachos and of what the halachos midrabanan are. And therefore, Shmuel does not allow it. Okay, now the Gemara goes more deeply into this machlokes. The Gemara says, is machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Are you allowed to reverse the Bittul Rishos or not? Shmuel says you cannot reverse Bittul Rishos. Rav says you do. The Gemara is going to drop what we just said. The Gemara is going to go back to the old assumption, which is that the machlokes is based on the question of whether or not you're allowed to do Bittul Rishos on 2 neighboring chatzeros, which aren't sharing a chatzor. They're not shared chatzeros, they're neighboring chatzeros. The Gemara assumes that they are dependent on each other. And the Gemara assumes that Shmuel holds that you cannot do Bittul Rishos. You cannot reverse a Bittul Rishos is because once you were mevatel Rishos, you're out of the chatzor. It's no longer a shared chatzor, and Bittul Rishos no longer works. That means that for the other people to be mevatel their rishos so that you get it back no longer works. And the Gemara says, Rav obviously disagrees with that. So the Gemara wants to say that this is based on a machlokes tanaim. The Gemara is going to try 2 attempts to frame this machlokes as being part of a machlokes tanaim. The Gemara's first attempt is a machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanon. When a person does Bittul Rishos, does he only give up his rights to the chatzor, or does he also give up his rights to the house? The Rabbanan hold that a person who gives up his rights to the yard, one who does Bittul Rishos, still retains rights to his house. That being the case, this would fit very nicely into Rav's opinion that you can do Bittul Rishos, because since he still retains rights to his house, he just gives up the yard, but he still retains rights to his house, he's not totally gone from this chatzor. He's not totally gone from here. He still has rights. There's still a joint ownership here. And therefore, it's not considered to be 2 neighboring yards It's not considered to be no joint ownership in the yard. There is a joint ownership, and therefore the other people can still do Bittul Rishus and give him back his rights. That would seem to fit with Rav, who says that you are allowed to do Bittul Rishus, to give back the rights. So he holds like the Rabbanan, who say that the person still retains the rights to his house. Shmuel, who says that you can't reverse it. You cannot do Bittul Rishus anymore. Shmuel would hold like Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you've completely lost your rights. When you give up your rishus, you even give up your house. Therefore, you're totally out of this yard. It's not a shared ownership anymore. You're totally gone. And therefore, you cannot do Bittul Rishus. The other people who received your rights cannot do Bittul Rishus and give it back to you. The Gemara says not necessarily, it doesn't really line up at all. It could be two totally independent machloksin. Rav could say, I fit perfectly into Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that you give up your house. It could be that you give up your house, but it doesn't mean that you're out of the chutzner. You give up the rights to walk in your house. You don't totally remove yourself from the chutzner. You're still here. You still own the land. You're just giving up your rights. And therefore, I could very much hold that it's still considered to be a shared chutzner, even though I hold like Rabbi Eliezer. And Shmuel will say, I could fit very well in the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon say you don't give up your rights to your house, but what you do give up, which is your chutzner, you totally remove yourself. You're totally gone. You're not involved. And you have no rights to it at all. It's not jointly owned, and therefore you cannot return the rishus anymore. Okay, the Gemara now tries another Machlokas Tanaim to see if it lines up with this Machlokas Rav and Shmuel. This Machlokas Tanaim is about, it's between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. It's a Machlokas about somebody who wants to reverse his own Bittul Rishus. It means that somebody was Mevatel his Rishus, now he wants to change his mind. He wants to take back his Rishus. So what does he do? He goes and he uses the Chatzar. If he goes and starts using the chutzner, he's taking back his rights. Now, this, of course, only works if the other party hasn't already been koneh his rights, meaning if he hasn't started using the chutzner yet, so that means that he hasn't taken possession of the rights that this person abandoned. Therefore, he could take his rights back. Once the other person already started using the chutzner, then he took possession of these rights. He can't take them back. But as long as he hasn't taken possession of it, those rights are still out there. They're still kind of floating. So this guy, if he starts using the chutzner again, he takes it back. So now, if he goes on purpose, he remembers that he gave up his rights, and he goes and says, I'm using it anyway, and I'm taking my rights back, then he definitely gets back his rights. The question is, what happens if he forgets? Yeah, he starts using the yard accidentally. He forgot. And does that cancel his Bittul Rishus or not? So Rabbi Meir says yes, it cancels his Bittul Rishus, and therefore nobody else is allowed to carry the yard anymore. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's just B'shogeg, it doesn't cancel anything. So now the Gemara wants to say, so obviously Rabbi Meir, who says that even if you forget and you just start using your chutzner again, that you get back your rishus, he obviously holds you're not totally gone from the chutzner. You still have rights within the chutzner, and therefore that would be holding like the opinion that says that you still have rights, and therefore the other person is allowed to abandon his rights to you because it's still jointly owned. And Rabbi Huda, who says that if you do it accidentally, you don't get back your rights, holds that you're totally gone from the chutzner, and therefore it's no longer a shared chutzner, and you can't do Bittul Rishus to give the rights back to him. The Gemara says this is not true. This is not the case. Actually, really, but the truth is that everybody holds you're totally gone from the chutzner. You're totally out, and everybody would say that the other person can't do Bittul Rishus and give you your rights back. The only reason that Rabbi Meir says, even when it's a shogeg, when he accidentally forgets and starts using it again, that he gets back his rights, the reason for that is a gzeira shogeg atu mezid. We're afraid if we allow the person to use it b'shogeg and not cancel his Bittul Rishus, then what he may actually do is use it on purpose and then claim afterwards that it was a shogeg. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to leave that window, and therefore we say that you can't do it. Even if you do it b'shogeg, you do use the chutzner b'shogeg, you do cancel your Bittul Rishus, and everybody else is not allowed to carry here anymore. Okay, that concludes this discussion about Bittul Rishus. The Gemara now refers back to our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, we had seen a discussion of the halachos of a nachri, an idol worshipper, and the Mishnah had said that you cannot do Bittul Rishus, you cannot do Erev Chatzeres with a nachri, you have to do Schiras Rishus. And then the Gemara brought a story with Rabbi Gamliel about a tzedukki. So the Gemara says tzedukki, he was talking about a tzedukki. A tzedukki were the Jews who didn't hold of Torah Shabbal Peh. They were considered apikarsim to a level, but they were Jews to some extent. What does that have to do with a nachri? So Gemara says, who's talking about a tzedukki? Why are we bringing in a story about a tzedukki when we just learned halachos of a nachri? So Gemara says there's a line missing from the Mishnah, which you have to say is as follows. The Tanakama holds that a tzeduki is the same as an achri, and therefore you cannot do bittul rishos of any sort. Rabbi Gamliel holds no, a tzeduki is like a Jew, and you could do bittul rishos. And on that we bring the story where Rabbi Gamliel says that we had a chutzner, and there was a tzeduki who lived in the chutzner, and my father said, quickly make sure that you start using the chutzner so that he does not prevent us from being able to use the chutzner on Shabbos. And the reason for that is because he's a Yisrael. And it would aser us, we wouldn't be able to use the chaser. By us using it, then it becomes ours. What had happened? There was a bittul rishos that was done. That tzeduki has the din of a Jew who's allowed to do bittul rishos, and therefore he did a bittul rishos. Rabbi Gamliel was afraid that he was going to cancel his bittul rishos and was going to start using the chutzner again. He was going to get rid of that bittul rishos. So he said, quickly go run and start using it. That way you'll have acquired the rights that he abandoned, and then he can't take them back. And that's what he was trying to say. But you see, Rabbi Gamliel is holding that the tzeduki has the halacha of Yisrael, and he could do bittul rishos as long as he doesn't try to grab it back before you get a chance to acquire it. Now the Gemara brings a brisa that spells this out. It actually has this entire discussion. It discusses a tzeduki, a baisusi, and it brings the story. And Rabbi Gamliel is actually spelling that out. Now this is all Rabbi Meir's version. Rabbi Yehuda has a different version of the story. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Rabbi Gamliel held that a tzeduki has the halacha of a goy, and he can't do bittul rishos. And in that story, it's not that the tzeduki had done bittul rishos, and Rabbi Gamliel was afraid he was going to take it back, and he told his kids, go quickly start using it so that you acquire the bittul rishos before he takes it back. That's not what was happening. There's no bittul rishos. You can't do bittul rishos. The tzeduki is like a guy. You can't do bittul rishos. What happened was that Rabbi Meir was that Rabbi Gamliel told his kids, quickly go use the chutzner because soon it's going to be Shabbos. And once it's Shabbos, you can't use the chutzner anymore because you can't carry it in anymore because there's a guy here, and there is no bittul rishos, and we haven't been able to do schiras rishos either, and therefore you have to quickly go get everything that you need done before Shabbos.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.